They called it Operation Western Wind. On the reports, it looked clean and impressive. 83 people convicted, 624 years of prison time, 14 years of illegal trade smashed in a few months. If you only looked at the numbers, you'd think it was a victory. But numbers don't show you how it started. It didn't begin with a spy or a defecting colonel or a suitcase full of microfilm. It began with something you could find on any coffee table in Paris. One French fashion magazine. Not a bomb, not a code book, just paper and ink and photos of women in coats that almost no one in the Soviet Union would ever touch. And that one magazine would be enough to wreck dozens of lives, tear families apart, and leave one factory guard waking up at night for the rest of his life, hearing a knock that wasn't there. Before any of that, someone had to open a hidden compartment. February 16, 1981. 9:47 a.m., Lviv, Ukrainian SSR. Inside a KGB garage, a green ZIL truck stood under bright lamps. For almost 4 hours, technicians had been crawling over it like surgeons examining a stubborn patient. They'd tapped metal seams, dragged magnetometers along the floor, shoved mirrors into dark corners. Nothing. The cargo bed sounded solid. The welds looked factory-made. The undercarriage was caked in the usual winter filth. But the order was clear: search everything. One of the technicians tried one more time. He knelt, pressed his knuckles against the steel under the cargo bed, and gave it a sharp, practiced tap. The sound that came back was wrong. Too light, too hollow. He tried again, a few centimeters to the side, different tone. He looked up at the KGB officer watching from a few steps away. "Captain, this section isn't solid," he said. Captain Alexei Volkov stepped closer. From a distance, he'd seen 100 trucks just like this. To him, it was just another job, another inspection in a long career of handling other people's secrets. Up close, the welds were good, very good. Whoever had done this had copied factory patterns, not some backyard hack job. "Cut it," Volkov said. The technicians drew a line along the suspicious area, sparks showering the concrete floor. The smell of burnt metal mixed with cold air and machine oil. When the metal plate finally came free, they pried it open. What lay inside did not look dangerous. But if you'd spent your whole life being told that ideas were more dangerous than bullets, then this was a weapon. They found a little Western world, hidden in Soviet steel. 47 glossy magazines, 23 music cassettes, 12 paperback novels. All of it carefully packed, wrapped to avoid moisture, stacked so nothing bent or broke. Flashbulbs popped. Officers logged each item, tagged them, dropped them into evidence bags. Volkov barely looked at the pictures on the covers. Blonde models in fur coats, men in tailored suits, couples smiling on streets that didn't have potholes. He didn't care about the clothes. He cared about the path those items had taken to get here. How many people had paid? Who had carried them? Who had decided it was safe to weld a secret world under the floor of a truck? The answer wasn't in the steel. It was waiting upstairs. Yuri Savchenko's apartment was small, like most apartments built in the 1960s. Cheap wallpaper, a worn sofa, a kitchen that had seen too many cups of black tea and not enough fresh paint. The search team tore through it with the same patience they'd used on the truck. Drawers came out, rugs were rolled up, walls were tapped, cabinets were emptied. In the kitchen, one officer rapped his knuckles on a wooden panel near the pipes. The sound was just slightly off. They pulled the panel away. Behind it was a cavity. Inside, wrapped in plain cloth, was a notebook. No lock, no fancy cover. Just a thick, battered thing, bulging from years of use. Volkov slipped on gloves and opened it. The first pages were enough to make him forget the magazines. Names, dates, addresses, payment amounts. Short notes in the margins. Warsaw Route reliable. Prague crossing only Tuesdays. Border guard Litvinov, 50 rubles monthly. This wasn't a diary. It wasn't a shopping list. It was a ledger. Not of one man's crime, but of an entire shadow economy. 14 years of business, carefully recorded in neat Cyrillic. Volkov turned the pages and felt something shift in his chest. One truck driver was a small case. One notebook that touched dozens of cities, border posts, and officials. That was promotion material. He shut the notebook and looked at the man sitting handcuffed in his own living room, face pale, eyes empty. Yuri Savchenko didn't look like a mastermind. He looked like every other tired Soviet man in his 40s, worn down, shoulders slightly hunched, hair thinning. But on paper, he was suddenly something else, the center of a network. Volkov walked to the phone. "Get this ledger to headquarters," he said, "and find out everywhere this man has ever driven." 10 days earlier, none of this existed, at least not officially. February 6, 1981, 7:14 a.m., factory number 47, Lviv. Step outside with him for a moment. The cold hits you like a slap. -11. The kind of cold that finds the gap between your gloves and your sleeves, creeps under your collar, and settles in your bones. Behind the barbed wire and the metal gate, factory number 47 churns out electronic components for Soviet communications gear. The state calls it strategic. The workers call it work. No one calls it warm. For 9 years, Viktor Stepanovich Koval has stood at this gate. Same routine, same view. Same ache in his joints every winter. Check IDs, check bags, sign the logbook. Pretend that his little square of concrete is the front line of national security. At 7:15, he lifts a hand. Random inspection. That phrase means many things in the Soviet Union. Today, it means that 5 workers have to step out of line and open their bags. Thermos. Bread wrapped in paper. A Russian book. A scarf. Boring, safe, normal. Then he opens the 5th bag. A simple canvas thing. Frayed strap. A life packed into fabric. He moves aside a lunch container. A pair of gloves. A rolled-up sweater. Then he sees it. Color that doesn't belong here. A glossy cover, too bright, too smooth. The kind of paper that catches the weak winter light and throws it back. The letters across the top are not Cyrillic. "Take this out, please," Viktor says. The woman holding the bag hesitates. It's less than a second. If you blink, you miss it. Viktor doesn't. 9 years at the gate have taught him to listen to silence, to watch for the smallest tightening of a jaw, the quickest flick of eyes toward the exit. She pulls out the magazine, French text, models in long coats, striking poses on streets that look nothing like Lviv. Title at the top, Mode et beauté, Western, expensive, fresh. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlovna Marchenko, 29 years old. Assembly line supervisor, married, 1 child, not a spy, not an official. Just a person who was supposed to pass the gate like everyone else. "Where did you get this?" Viktor asks. "At a second-hand market," she says, voice flat. "Weeks ago, I wanted to see the sewing patterns." He flips through the pages. The paper is smooth, no torn corners, no greasy fingerprints, no folded edges. This magazine hasn't lived a hard Soviet life. It looks like it's barely been touched. He could close the bag, he could hand it back, he could pretend he believed her. But this is 1981. And in 1981, pretending can cost you everything. If he lets this go and someone else finds out, he's the one who'll be on the other side of the table. Not her. If he reports it, she might never walk through this gate again. In that moment, Viktor isn't choosing between right and wrong. He's choosing between someone else's life and his own. He picks up the phone. 20 minutes later, the magazine is lying on a desk deeper inside the factory complex. Across from it, Lyudmila sits on a chair that suddenly feels too small. Her hands shake in her lap. Next to the desk stands Major Oleg Vladimirovich Krasny, the KGB liaison assigned to the factory. Officially, he handles security issues. In reality, he decides which mistakes become crimes. By 2:15 in the afternoon, Lyudmila is no longer a worker. She is a person of interest under preliminary investigation. By evening, she is in a cell. The interrogation room has no windows, no clock, just a metal table, 4 walls painted a depressing institutional green, and the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Lyudmila sits on one side. 2 KGB officers sit on the other. Krasny watches from a corner, like a teacher grading an exam. The questions are simple, at first. Which market? Which day? What time? How much did you pay? Describe the stall. What did the seller look like? She repeats the story. Second-hand market. A stall with books and old things. She doesn't remember the exact date, or the exact time, or the seller's face. The officers let her talk until the details stop lining up. Then they switch. You're not being honest. We already know you're lying. We have witnesses. We're trying to help you, but you're making it worse. They lean in closer. You're probably just a victim. Someone used you. You're a good Soviet citizen who got involved with the wrong people. Give us a name, they say, and you can go home sooner. Hours go by. Imagine that room for a moment. No phone, no watch, no friendly faces, just men who can decide if your child grows up with a mother or with a photograph. By 8:47 p.m., her story finally cracks. She didn't buy the magazines in a market. A friend gave them to her. Tatiana, a shipping clerk, works at Lviv Transport Collective No. 12. Access to cargo routes and manifests. Over the past 2 years, this Tatiana had given her 3 or 4 Western magazines. Always quietly, always wrapped, always with the same line. Don't show this to anyone. Lyudmila gives them the full name, Tatiana Igorevna Bondar. By 10 p.m., Tatiana is no longer just a name in someone's kitchen. She's a new file on Major Krasny's desk. 4 days later, the knock comes for her. February 10th, 9:15 a.m. Lviv Transport Collective No. 12 looks like every other Soviet office. Gray walls, worn desks, hanging portraits of leaders who have never set foot here. Tatiana is in the middle of checking a stack of paperwork. Freight numbers, route codes, the ordinary language of goods moving from one place to another. 2 men in plain clothes stop at her desk. Tatiana Igorevna Bondar? Yes. You need to come with us, one of them says. Security matter. No explanation, no warrant held up dramatically. That only happens in films. Here, people understand what those words mean. Her colleagues suddenly discover that their papers are very interesting. No one looks up. No one asks where she's going. You don't ask those questions if you want a quiet life. Within 30 minutes, Tatiana is sitting in the same kind of windowless room. Her approach is different. She insists she bought the magazines at second-hand markets. She just likes Western fashion. She doesn't know any smugglers. She doesn't know any routes. She doesn't know why she's here. The KGB officers already know that no one in Lviv is casually selling brand-new French fashion magazines in the snow. The lie itself becomes part of the case. On the 5th day, something inside her gives way. She tells them about Yuri Mikhailovich Savchenko, mid-40s, truck driver, employer, Soviet Transport Enterprise No. 8, regular international routes to Poland, side business, Western magazines, music cassettes, small items that fit into empty spaces under tarps and behind toolboxes. She met him through work. 3 years of quiet deals, magazines, a few cassette tapes. Sometimes a bottle of perfume passed through her hands and into someone else's apartment. He never looked like a criminal. Just another driver with a tired back and a wallet that was somehow always a little thicker than it should have been. Her last contact with him was 2 weeks ago. That's all the KGB needs. The raid comes at dawn. February 16th, 6 a.m. The building on Franco Street is still half asleep. Frost crusts the windows. Radios mumble quiet news through thin walls. Somewhere, someone is boiling water for tea. 8 KGB agents move into position. 2 at the back entrance. 4 in the stairwell. 2 waiting in idling cars on the street. Exhaust steaming in the cold. Captain Volkov leads the team to the 3rd floor. They don't bother with gentle knocking. KGB, open the door. Inside, Yuri is buttoning his shirt, thinking about the road to Warsaw, about checkpoints, about the weather. The shout hits him like an electric shock. For 3 seconds, he doesn't move. You can measure a man's life in those 3 seconds. Window, back door, hide something, say nothing. He takes 2 steps toward the window. "He's running!" someone yells from the courtyard. The second hit breaks the lock. The door explodes inward, wood splintering across the hallway. Yuri turns from the window into 4 pistols pointed at his chest. On the floor, now! He drops, cheek to carpet, hands behind his head, cold metal around his wrists. In 5 minutes, his apartment stops being his. It becomes evidence. Drawers, floorboards, shelves, light fixtures, everything is suspect. In the bedroom, under a false bottom in the closet, they find the first stash. 200 packs of Western cigarettes. 3,400 rubles in cash. A notebook, not the notebook. A smaller one, local deals. Names written in shorthand. Volkov flips through it, then hands it to an officer. "This is small," he says. "His truck will be bigger." The search in the garage proves him right. You already know what they found under the cargo bed. Magazines, cassettes, books, Western faces staring up into Soviet fluorescent light. But that's not what really scares people like Colonel Melnick. Paper and tape are easy to burn. Ink on a ledger is harder to erase. 2 days later, the main notebook, the one pulled from Yuri's kitchen, lies open on a long table at KGB headquarters in Lviv. February 18th, 1981. Colonel Dmitry Arkadyevich Melnick is 52. His hair is thinning, his uniform fits a little too tightly around the waist, and his eyes have the flat, tired look of someone who has spent 3 decades serving a system that never says thank you. "How many names?" he asks. Major Krasny runs a finger down his notes. 67 clearly identified from the ledger, he says. 19 already detained. 6 truck drivers listed. 4 located. 2 believed to be in Poland. At least 14 border guards suspected of regular bribe-taking. Melnick listens without interrupting. He could keep this small. Focus on the drivers, on the border guards, on the people who turned corruption into a business. Instead, he sees something else. Not a smuggling case, an opportunity. "I want everyone," he says. The room goes quiet. Not just the organizers, not just the guards, everyone who participated. Anyone who bought, anyone who sold, anyone who carried, anyone mentioned in that ledger, no matter how small. One investigator shifts in his seat. Comrade Colonel, that could mean hundreds. Some only bought a magazine once or twice. They didn't know. Melnick cuts him off with a look. "This is not about whether they knew," he says. "This is about showing that there is no such thing as small participation in an illegal network that undermines Soviet security." He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. In that moment, 83 lives are effectively decided. It still doesn't have a name. Operations like this always get a name. After a short discussion, someone suggests one that sounds neutral enough on paper and cold enough in reality. Operation Western Wind. Within days, the wind starts blowing. February 22nd, 5:23 a.m. Imagine being Ivan Petrovich Korkov for a moment. You're an engineer in Kyiv. You design circuits, not conspiracies. 2 years ago, you bought 2 Western music cassettes from a friend of a friend who knew a truck driver. You played them a dozen times. ABBA, some French singer whose name you never quite caught. Then you put them in a drawer and went back to ordinary life. Then, at 5:23 in the morning, someone starts pounding on your door like the building is on fire. You stumble out of bed, heart pounding, feet cold on the floor. Who is it? KGB, open the door. By the time the lock turns, your life is already split into before and after. 4 agents push past you. Ivan Petrovich Korkov. The lead one reads from a document. You are under arrest for participation in an illegal smuggling network providing Western materials to Soviet citizens. You stare at him. What smuggling? You manage to say. I never smuggled anything. You purchased Western music cassettes from Yuri Mikhailovich Savchenko in 1979, the agent replies. 2 cassettes, 15 rubles, payment recorded. Your children wake up to the noise and stand in the hallway watching their father being handcuffed. He'll be gone for 4 years. 2 days later, in Lviv, a woman named Svetlana Mikhailovna Romanova hears the same knock. Her crime? Buying 1 French fashion magazine in 1980. 8 rubles, 3 years. By early March, 43 people are in custody. By mid-March, all 67 names from the ledger have been found and processed. By April, with additional investigations and connected cases, the final number reaches 83. On paper, Operation Western Wind is a success. The reports talk about neutralizing criminal structures, protecting ideological stability, demonstrating the reach of Soviet law. In cells scattered across the Ukrainian SSR, it feels different. It feels like lives dropped into a shredder because someone, somewhere, decided that fear was the most efficient tool in the box. And the man who first lifted that magazine out of a canvas bag at factory number 47, Viktor Koval, he's about to learn what vigilance really costs in a system where the wrong decision doesn't just ruin your career, it ruins everything. For a while, Viktor Koval tried not to think about it. He told himself he'd just done his job. He hadn't written the laws. He hadn't run the investigation. He hadn't sentenced anyone. All he'd done was pick up a phone, say a few careful words, and pass a glossy magazine up the chain. The system had done the rest. But the system does not carry the memory. People do. In the months after Operation Western Wind began, the factory gate felt different. There were fewer workers in Lyudmila's department. Some had transferred. Some had simply disappeared. No one asked where, no one said prison, no one said labor camp. They said phrases like, she left the city, or he got into trouble, and then changed the subject, suddenly fascinated by the cracks in the pavement. Victor got a letter of commendation. It came folded in an envelope with a red stamp and a crisp smell of fresh ink, for vigilance and exemplary performance of duty in the protection of state security. The paper said he had helped uncover a dangerous network undermining socialist morality and ideological stability. It didn't mention names. It didn't mention children watching their parents taken away at dawn. It didn't mention that some of those parents' only crime was buying a magazine or a cassette. He pushed the letter into a drawer under his socks. He didn't hang it on the wall. At night, he started waking up at 5 a.m. Sometimes it was a dream about the gate. Sometimes it was a dream about a corridor with doors on both sides and the same knock echoing again and again. Always the same time. Always the same feeling in his chest. For the KGB, things moved on. The trials were fast. They always are when the verdict is decided before the defendant steps into the room. Courtrooms filled up with people who had never thought of themselves as criminals. Truck drivers, border guards, office clerks, housewives, students. Some tried to defend themselves. I only bought one magazine. I didn't know it was illegal. I thought it was permitted. We see Western films in the cinema. I never took money, I just carried a package once. The judges listened with faces carved from stone. The prosecutors didn't talk about magazines or cassettes. They used heavier words: smuggling, corruption of Soviet citizens, distribution of ideologically harmful materials, contacts with foreign entities. Words that made a magazine sound like a grenade. When the sentences were read, they came in numbers that did not match the crimes. 4 years, 6 years, 8, 10. Sometimes the numbers were smaller. 3 years here, 2.5 there. It didn't matter. Once you'd been inside, even 2 years could stretch across the rest of your life. One by one, they disappeared into trains headed north and east. You can picture those trains if you've ever seen footage of the Soviet Union in winter. Gray, long, breath steaming in the cold air. Inside, people sat on wooden benches, holding bags with everything they were allowed to take. Some cried, some stared straight ahead, some tried to make jokes. Most just sat silently and tried to understand how a cassette or a magazine had turned into a sentence measured in years. The camps were where they had always been. Behind barbed wire, in forests and frozen swamps, in places where the wind cut through layers of clothing and the snow squeaked under boots at -20. Men who had once driven trucks now hauled logs and coal. Women who had once stood at sewing machines now stood in lines, waiting for thin soup and bread. For some of them, the worst part wasn't the cold, or the work, or the guards. It was the knowledge that they weren't here for blowing up a bridge or selling state secrets. They were here because they'd wanted to listen to a song that wasn't on Soviet radio, or look at a life that wasn't available in Soviet stores. They had stepped into a story the state was telling itself about dangerous influences. And in stories like that, someone always has to be punished hard enough to scare everyone else. Back in Lviv, Colonel Melnik's file for Operation Western Wind thickened. There were charts showing flows of goods, tables with names, dates, and sentences, reports praising comprehensive liquidation of criminal channels. The higher-ups were pleased. He received his own decoration. His name appeared in an internal bulletin. Young officers were told to study the methods and efficiency of his operation. He slept well. He'd done his job. There is a certain kind of man who can look at 83 ruined lives and see only proof that the machine still works. History tends to remember their names in footnotes. The others, the people crushed under those footnotes, disappear. Unless someone, years later, opens a file and starts reading. Time moved. The Soviet Union had many operations with many names. Western Wind was one of dozens. On paper, it was completed successfully. By the late 1980s, some of the people sentenced in 1981 were returning home. They came back older, thinner, quieter, with eyes that had learned to check door frames and corners before stepping into a room. Some found their spouses still waiting. Some did not. Children had grown up. Neighbors had moved away. New people lived in old apartments. Life had gone on in their absence because it had to. They didn't talk much about what had happened to them. In the Soviet Union, there wasn't a lot of space to talk about things that made the system look cruel. You swallowed it or you broke. Sometimes, very quietly, someone would say, "It started with a magazine," or "I just wanted to hear that song again." And then they'd change the subject. In 1985, a new general secretary took over. In 1986 and 1987, new words started appearing in newspapers: glasnost, restructuring, rehabilitation. Cases that had once been untouchable started to be questioned. Some political prisoners were released. Some verdicts were reviewed. Some sentences were quietly erased, like chalk wiped off a board. Operation Western Wind was not famous enough to be debated on television. It existed in folders, in regional offices, on aging shelves. But the logic that had created it began to crack. People started saying things out loud that they would have never dared to say before. That the system was dangerous. That it broke people for nothing. That you could end up in a camp not because you were an enemy, but because you were unlucky. In 1991, the cracks stopped being cracks. The Soviet Union fell apart in a way that felt sudden and slow at the same time, like a building that has been on fire for hours and only now collapses. New flags went up. New governments were sworn in. Old institutions changed names or quietly died. In the early 1990s, in what was now independent Ukraine, the old KGB headquarters changed its plaque. Files that had once been inaccessible to ordinary people moved, box by box, to different archives. Some remained sealed, some didn't. And somewhere in one of those buildings, a brown cardboard folder labeled Operation Western Wind landed on a new shelf. It waited there for years. In 1996, a journalist named Andrei came across that folder by accident. He was researching a completely different story, black markets in the late Soviet era, when the name on the spine caught his eye. It sounded bland enough, Western Wind. But when he opened the folder and started reading, the blandness evaporated. He saw the ledger from Yuri Savchenko's kitchen, the interrogation reports for Lyudmila and Tatiana, the operation planning briefings, the sentencing lists. He saw the number 83 repeated again and again. 83 individuals, 624 total years of prison. He saw notes in the margins written in a careful, slightly annoyed hand. Sentence satisfactory. Sentence too lenient. Recommend additional surveillance of family. A picture started forming, not of a brave strike against a dangerous network, but of a machine in search of a demonstration case. He requested permission to copy some of the documents. It took weeks, signed forms, and dead-end conversations, but eventually he walked out of the building with enough material for a long article. It ran in a small newspaper that still cared about digging into the past. The headline was simple: "The operation that destroyed 83 lives over magazines and music." He wrote about Yuri, about Lyudmila, about Tatiana, about border guards who took envelopes and were sent away for 8 years, about a music teacher who bought a cassette to play Western songs to his students and ended up serving 3. He wrote about Victor, too, because the reports mentioned him. Information regarding suspicious Western magazine obtained thanks to the vigilance of Factory 47 guard, Comrade V.S. Koval. One line, that was all. No first name, no age, no story, just the word vigilance. Andrei didn't know if Victor was still alive. He wrote the article anyway. 2 days after it came out, in a cramped apartment in Lviv, a man in his late 50s turned the page of the newspaper and felt his heart stop for a moment. His hair was thinner now. His hands shook when he poured tea. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite pensioner who kept his balcony full of plants. He had not worked at Factory 47 for years. He had never spoken publicly about what happened in 1981. He had tried very hard not to remember certain faces, but the phrase jumped out at him from the middle of the page. Thanks to the vigilance of a factory guard named Viktor Stepanovich K., the journalist had respected privacy, had not printed the full surname. He didn't need to. Victor knew exactly who that sentence was about. He read the article slowly, line by line. He recognized some names. Some he had never seen before. He saw again in his mind Lyudmila's trembling hands, Tatiana being led away between two men in plain clothes, the glossy sheen of a magazine cover in the pale winter light. He read about Ivan in Kiev, taken for 2 cassettes, about Svetlana, sentenced for a single issue of a fashion magazine. He put the newspaper down and sat very still. For years, he had told himself that he hadn't known, that he couldn't have guessed what would happen, that he had simply followed procedure. But here, on paper, in front of him, was the full shape of what that procedure had turned into. You can spend your life saying, "I didn't mean it." It doesn't change what it meant for others. That night, Victor woke up at 5 a.m. again. This time, the knock he heard in his dream wasn't on someone else's door. It was on his. He didn't live long enough to see his name completely cleared or completely condemned. History rarely offers that kind of neatness. He died a few years later, of an ordinary heart that had spent too many nights listening for footsteps in the hallway. At his funeral, no one mentioned Operation Western Wind. They talked about his patience, his love for his grandchildren, his habit of bringing sugar cubes for neighborhood kids when sugar had been hard to find. People always have more than one story. The state had only ever cared about one of his, the one where he picked up a phone. What about the others? Some of the 83 had their sentences formally reviewed and mistakes acknowledged in the late 1990s or early 2000s. In practice, it meant a piece of paper saying the state now agreed that, technically, they shouldn't have been punished so harshly. It didn't give them back the years. It didn't erase the memories. But for a few, it mattered. Children who had grown up being told their father was a criminal discovered, from an archivist with a tired smile, that their father's crime had been wanting to own 2 cassettes and not wanting to rat out the man who sold them. For others, there was no paper, no rehabilitation, just the slow erosion of memory. They moved on, changed jobs, emigrated, died, told stories to their grandchildren that left out the coldest winters. The ledger from Yuri's kitchen now lies in a climate-controlled box. Scholars sometimes request it. They study it not as evidence in a criminal case, but as a map of how ordinary people tried to smuggle tiny pieces of another world into a closed country. Magazines, music, perfume, books, nothing that could blow up a bridge, everything that could open a mind. The notebook doesn't show fear, only names and numbers and routes. Fear is in the lines that were added later. Red pencil, different handwriting, arrested, sentenced, under surveillance, deceased. On a shelf in another building, the official KGB report on Operation Western Wind still looks proud of itself. It talks about effective neutralization, ideological protection, total exposure of criminal ties. No one listening to that report in 1982 could have guessed that, 40 years later, people would read it and shake their heads. Not because the operation was sloppy, because it was precise and merciless. If you wanted the lesson of Western Wind, it's not about smuggling. It's about what happens when a system decides that fear is more useful than justice. You can follow every rule. You can sign every paper. You can do exactly what you've been told. And still, years later, a stranger can open a file, read a line with your name in it, and understand that vigilance was just another word for someone else paid the price. It began with a magazine. It ended with 83 lives permanently bent out of shape. And if you want to understand the Cold War, you don't just look at the rockets and treaties. You look at a cold morning at a factory gate, at a guard with numb fingers and a phone in his hand, and at a choice that didn't look like a choice at all. Because history is rarely decided in rooms with flags and microphones. More often, It's decided in moments like that, when someone sees something they're not sure they should report and decides to pick up the phone.